Is this the best campaign setting book I've ever read? Let's find out. So the Into the Wyrd and the Wild Kickstarter was recommended to me by my pal Scott. I really knew nothing about the book or the author. I just took his word for it, backed it, and honestly didn't really pay much attention as the campaign went on. But the book just showed up on my doorstep and I've been reading through it and am absolutely blown away by this thing. Into the Wyrd and Wild by Charles Ferguson-Avery. This is a 240-ish page hardback book. It has everything you need to build a campaign setting for a very dark and dangerous wilderness adventure. And I should say before I crack open the book that a lot of the themes and the artwork inside this book are on the darker side, so be warned if that's something that you aren't interested in learning more about. But speaking of themes and everything, I'm actually gonna flip to the back of the book to this. Oh, hey, he signed it. I didn't realize that. That's nice. To this further reading section. So I think this is so cool and helpful because it gives a list of movies and video games and other books that inspired this book, but also I think what's so cool about it, it gives you as a dungeon master a point of reference or a way that you can sort of imagine and visualize what is going on in this book, and also helps explain it to your players. So if you run a game and you say it's inspired by the Bloodborne video games or Princess Mononoke, it gives your players an instant visual thematic reference to help them imagine what's going on. I think this page is so cool and helpful getting that across. Okay, so like I said, this is all about exploring a weird and wild wilderness. And I actually thought that this was gonna have a complete set of rules, like that this was a game to be run, but it's not. It is system neutral. So you can run this setting with whatever type of game you want, D&D or Pathfinder or OSR stuff, whatever. I mean, obviously it's a fantasy setting, so you're probably not going to want to run this with Mothership or something like that. This is a little introduction about all the thematic stuff. What it does have in terms of rules are some cool like add-on things for exploring a wilderness. So super cool artwork. So there's a way of changing gold into supply. So like, you know, gold isn't very useful in an expansive forest, but torches and rations are. So there's a way to switch gold into that stuff. Exhaustion mechanics, surviving the night, you know, things get more dangerous at night. There's a section on hunting and how that can work in the game, and also like what you get from hunting is pretty gross. There's moon phases, and then, you know, the longer you stay in the wild, you start to kind of mutate or change. So there's stuff like you gain a sense of magic where you can smell magic, or the trees sing to you. So there's a lot of cool stuff that can happen, but then there's also some stuff that's not so cool. You know, like your eyes going pale and irisless. So you start to unnerve civilized folk. You know, these cool little mutations that give the game flavor and change up the characters. Super awesome. There's rules for becoming lost, going mad. So these are like some definitely negative effects that can happen if you spend too long in the wild. And then we jump right into 100 pages of beasts and monsters. So because this is a system neutral setting, all of the stat blocks are super simple and easy to convert into whatever game you're running. And then it's just page after page of awesome monsters. So you have the stats over here on one side with some abilities. Each monster gets its own 2-page spread. And what I love about this layout is that you can just read the bold text as you're flipping through to get a really good idea of what this creature is. So the Bluckstound growls, the sound like a bundle of switches being twisted to their breaking point. It's like a tree dog. Sometimes there's extra boxes and descriptions here. These uncommon good boxes have what you can gather from the monster after you've slain it. Even the bestiary has random tables everywhere. Bramble beast, like yes. Just so many awesome monsters. The dryad rat, a bunch of different dryad, ether rat, like, yes. I just love the way this section is laid out because it has everything you need to quickly get an idea of what the monster is. And then all of the text and writing is so evocative and just gets your imagination going. It really inspires encounters. I think the purpose of what some might think is overly descriptive text, like, what the heck is this thing? Is more to inspire you. And this is a book about preparing. Look at this monster. Yeah. It's a book about preparing, not just using this to run at the table, but you definitely can. Okay, so let's skip forward. There's so many monsters. 100 pages of monsters. So the next section is the factions, and there are 5 factions within the Wild. The Court of the Broken Branches. She's like a queen that takes wounded animals and monsters and saves them or raises them up and treats them all super fairly. There's the Children of Icreomeron. These are like beasts that live and reproduce all over the Wild, but they all share the same soul. It's like a lich that has split their soul into a bunch of different parts, but it's all split into animals that can reproduce and grow stronger the more of them there are. There's the Ruin, this evil dude, the Wild Elves, you know, the Fey creatures, and the Primal Wheel. So these are kind of like the old gods. And what's really great about having these factions is you can have just 1 or 2 or 3 or all of them in the Wild, and they're all sort of around, and whenever the players cause trouble, they will definitely run into these factions. And, you know, basically whatever the players do when they're in the Wild, these factions will take notice. They're not necessarily villains, but they are the sort of reoccurring characters that you can have in the campaign that just make it feel like a living place. So next we jump into artifacts. And this section is insane. The layout here gets a little packed tight because there's so many cool items to look through that everything's just kind of jammed in here together. It's all in alphabetical order. It's all super useful stuff. A lot of them are things that will help the players survive. I really love the writing because each item has a sort of italicized part, like what you would read to the player, and then it has what the item actually does underneath it. Really clear. Just a super fun section to flip through and find some magic items that your players will want. You know, before you run a session of the game, you can just flip through and see if there's any cool items that would make sense showing up. Stuff like Flute of the Swamp Piper. You play the flute and you can summon little creatures while you're in the swamp. So a cloud of pesky, obscuring gnats, or a plague of leaping, slippery frogs. Tons and tons of awesome stuff. But the awesome doesn't end there. Now we get to the magic section, the Wyrd, in the Wyrd in the Wild. So a bunch of spells. A lot of these would be super helpful for surviving the Wild. Stuff like Furry Pelt, a level 1 spell where your skin sprouts a thin layer of fur that protects you from the cold. Stuff like Growing Horns, Pack Mule so you can carry more stuff, or Soothing Moss. You create a bed of moss that helps you rest better. But then there's also more dangerous stuff like Swarm Form, a level 4 spell where your body twists and crumbles away, and in place there's a swarm of vermin. That sounds pretty rad. Taste of Blood, Tongue of Raven, just tons of cool stuff. So here we have the dungeon, and this section is basically an easy way of converting a giant section of forest into something that more resembles a dungeon. So basically a method of creating a hex crawl that is really like a point crawl. Really cool, simple system that would make it easy to prepare, you know, a couple of hexes if you only have an hour or so before your next game. Then we jump straight back into more inspiring stuff to flesh out the world. A bunch of wild flora, just tons and tons of flavor and mechanics all jammed in here. Just one after another. You know, your players are going to be exploring this wilderness and they're going to want every advantage they can to survive. So having a bunch of interesting plants for them to look at and try and figure out what they do, always super fun. Diseases, just some gnarly stuff to make this campaign even darker. There's like mire creeps, these little fungal infections that get into your skin and then blow up if it gets too hot. And if it wasn't dangerous enough, there's more hazards and traps. There's so much stuff in here that it's almost overwhelming. But what's cool is you could definitely run an entire campaign from this book. And just to help even more, there's table upon table of random stuff so you can name your wilderness. These are ways of setting the scene, so you have types of woods, smells and sounds, encounters and mood. And then this, I think, another one of these just amazing sections is 100 Wyrd locations. So really simple, you know, your players take a turn that you didn't expect. You can just roll a D100 and they come upon one of these weird happenings, like an enormous owl statue or fruit trees of rotten truth. It just has everything you need to fill out a campaign in the wilderness. Factions, monsters, these random happenings that are still probably dangerous but aren't necessarily always a fight. The last one here is super cool. It's a dragon that's been impaled on a tree and now lives there. She holds court with followers and trades and information. Just tons of random awesome stuff to deal with in between fighting monsters, dealing with the different factions, and trying to survive the night. So why do I think Into the Wyrd and Wild is so good? So while the setting of Into the Wyrd and Wild is maybe a little dark for my preferences, everything about the writing, the illustrations, it all goes back to everything in this book is in support of this theme of exploring a dangerous wilderness. And reading through a book that is that thematic is just super inspiring. And on top of that, this book is organized so perfectly. You know, it's not like some of these books where it's just a list of do this, then do this, then do this. And while I think that's awesome for some games, if you're a dungeon master that's trying to get a little more creative and you want to run your own thing and you need just a little bit of help to come up with ideas on how to structure the play from week to week or month to month, however often you play, it's a really cool resource to be able to read through something, get inspired, use it to prepare. You can also bust it out at the table to help you run the game. You know, it's not like any of this stuff needs to be memorized to play. And yes, if you are looking for a dark, dangerous setting or a wilderness setting, you basically have to check out this book. And I've been so inspired by this book that I'm sort of restructuring this month's Patreon adventure to be a little bit more open and exploration driven. If you don't know, every month I release a new adventure zine on my Patreon. Check out the link in the description. It's a great way to support the channel and also get a zine written and drawn by me in the mail every month. Okay, that's it for this one. Let me know what you think of Into the Wyrd and Wild. I was just so surprised and taken by this book that I thought it would be fun to do a little review and let some of you know about it because I'm in love. All right, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!